Okay, we're on part 3 of the midterm study guide. So question 18 was asking you about taxation without representation and what events. So pretty much any tax that is going to occur right before the revolution begins is going to be a taxation without representation. So the event that kind of triggers that comment is going to be the Stamp Act. So remember, Britain passes a Stamp Act, a tax on like all paper legal material. And so that creates the Stamp Act Congress, Sons of Liberty start. And so a lot of protests. And remember, the colonists use protests, boycotts, and then eventually violence. So what does it really mean? It means that the colonies felt that Britain could not tax them unless they had a colonial representative in Parliament. So what's happening in Parliament is that it's just British people in Parliament. How Britain thinks of that is that the colonists are British. They are not Americans. They are not separate from Britain. So when they say you have representatives, in their opinion, they're right. They do have British citizens in Parliament, and they consider the colonists British citizens. However, you have 100 years where these colonists have been here. That independent spirit has started, so they don't see themselves as British anymore. They kind of see themselves as different. So they don't feel that there's a colonial representative in Parliament. And remember how they kind of feel is, unless you're here in the colonies and you understand the daily struggle, how can you represent us? So when we create our United States government, that is why you have representatives from each of your states. Like the people here in North Carolina, they understand North Carolina issues. They live here, they come back here, they visit, they stay in contact with the citizens of North Carolina. So this taxation without representation, Britain could have fixed it maybe by giving each of the colonies a representative in Parliament, but they don't because they believe in universal representation. Question 19 is asking you to identify each term below and its significance. So these are like terms that are within our government, documents. So the consent of the governed is people agree to follow the government in exchange for government protecting their freedom. So this is one of our Enlightenment philosophies that we actually have in our Constitution. We consent to the Constitution as long as the government is upholding it. Now, whenever the government is not upholding their end of this bargain, it is your constitutional right, it is your right as a citizen to go ahead and rebel, or to at least question it. The separation of powers is the 3 branches of government. So we have a legislative, an executive, and a judicial. So Article 1 creates the legislative branch, and the legislative branch's job is to just make the laws. And so our legislative branch is called Congress. Congress is when both the House and the Senate meet together. Other than that, it's just the House and then the Senate. But when they meet together, they're here in Congress. Now, the Article 2 creates the executive branch, and the executive branch is headed by the president, and he has the vice president and his cabinet and all the executive agencies helping him enforce the laws, because that is what the executive branch is supposed to do. Article 3 created the judiciary branch, and the judiciary branch's head is going to be the Supreme Court and then the other federal courts that happen after it. Their job is to interpret the U.S. Constitution and to determine whether laws are legal or illegal. And remember, they get an extra power with that Marbury versus Madison ruling. They get judicial review. So this is what separation of powers means. Each one of them has a distinct job description, and that is where they're supposed to stay. Popular sovereignty, pop, is people. And then sovereignty, if you look at this part right here, it looks like rain. People rule in this country, and people rule by a system of voting. So at the beginning of the nation, when we look at this era, pretty much for a really long time, we're going to look at just white guys being able to vote. But at the very, very beginning, it's going to be white male property owners, and you had to own a significant amount of land in order for you to be considered a property owner, but you will be able to vote. When time goes on with President John Quincy Adams, he is going to federally drop that restriction on the property owner. So it'll just be white males who will actually be able to vote. Of course, you have to be a citizen. Okay, let me just clarify that. Now, the preamble is the introduction to the United States Constitution. And what the preamble does is it gives the purpose of the government. It is telling you what the government is supposed to do. Okay, and it just does it very simple. All right, the delegated powers are also known as our express powers, our explicit powers. These are powers that are actually written into the United States Constitution. So they're there in black and white. And these powers are given to the U.S. national government. And because these powers are given, they can do certain things, like I gave you the example here of they have the power to coin currency. How they get extra power is by using these delegated powers, expressed or explicit powers. And so you got coin currency. You can siphon off powers using an implied power. Okay, so we'll look at that in the next part. So implied powers are also known as like the necessary and proper clause. So these are powers that are not necessarily written in the Constitution, but they're kind of there. They're not directly written, but they're implied. They're implicit. So it allowed the government to expand and reduce its power as needed. So like under President John Adams, he created a brand new position in our cabinet. And remember, the cabinet itself is an implied power. President Washington creates it because he needs help carrying out the law, carrying out his job. So John Adams does the same thing. He adds another position, and so now we have 4 secretaries of the United States. So we have the Secretary of Navy. At this point, 4. We have a lot today. But President Adams is going to go ahead, and he does this because his job is to protect the United States. He's supposed to protect you and me. That's a constitutional thing. So he takes that power to defend, and he siphons power off. See, the power to defend is explicit. It's written. Takes that power, and he kind of siphons something else off of it. He siphons this Secretary of Navy. And he does it, remember, to protect our shorelines, particularly back then when Britain and France are attacking us on a regular basis out there on the open ocean. Reserve powers are powers that are not necessarily given to the federal government. They go to the states. So the 10th Amendment really kind of clarifies this, but reserve powers are powers that are not given to the federal government. They go to the state. So think about education. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the federal government has to give students an education. And they didn't really, like, remember when we looked at colonial America, in the New England area, you'll have tax-supported schools. That means the state, the area is paying for it. But in the South, you had private tutors and you had private schools. But you didn't have anything that was tax-supported. So when education kind of becomes a big thing during this American II that you guys will study, progressivism, you'll start seeing tax-supported schools, and states will run it, not the federal government. So that's why every state has a little bit difference in how they do education. Federalists believe in a strong central government, and they support the ratification of the United States Constitution. Remember, this is at the Constitutional Convention that the Federalists happened. And what they agree to do is to go ahead and add a Bill of Rights to get the Anti-Federalists to go ahead and sign it. Our Anti-Federalists are at the Constitutional Convention. They've been writing the Constitution, and after they read it, they're kind of like, this is too strong of a document. So they put little breaks to the system. Maybe this isn't something we want to go ahead and rush right now. Maybe we need to clarify some of these powers and these things. They were a little bit afraid. You created the Articles of Confederation, which was extremely weak, and now you go to the Constitution that's going to be exceptionally strong. You're going from one end of the spectrum to the other end. You're going from one end to the next. And they kind of wanted something maybe a little bit more in the middle, and they weren't willing to sign off. So in order to get the Anti-Federalists to convince their states to sign off on the Constitution, the Federalists go ahead and they agree to add the Bill of Rights. But the Federalists really believe in a strong state government because who knows you best? Your state. They want a limited central government. but they do agree to ratify the U.S. Constitution if the Bill of Rights is actually added. The Anti-Federalists are not a political party, but it's not odd when Democrat-Republicans start during Washington's administration that those same people who would have called themselves Anti-Federalists are now going to call themselves Democrat-Republicans. So they're not the same. There is a difference. The Anti-Federalists are not a political party, whereas the Democrat-Republicans will be. The Federalists will become a political party during Washington's administration. But those guys who are Federalists, they tend to be Federalists at the Constitutional Convention. And then when the actual Federalist Party is started, they are Federalists, okay? So the next question, question 20, is constitutional compromises. So we've talked about this with Era 3, but at the Great Compromise, sorry, I had to pause the video. At the Great Compromise, what has happened is we've got a legislative branch that people are really divided on. And at this Great Compromise, you have a Virginia plan and you have a New Jersey plan. The Virginia plan would like to see a bicameral, a two-house legislative branch, and they want representation based on population. The New Jersey plan wants to see a unicameral, a one-house legislative branch. Now, when they say this one branch, they also want one vote per state. And that was pretty much what was happening under the Articles of Confederation. So Virginia and New Jersey are battling it out, and then the great state of Connecticut comes up with the Great Compromise. They take a little bit of the Virginia plan, they take a little bit of the actual New Jersey plan, and they come up with a Great Compromise. So what they get is two houses, a bicameral legislative branch. Okay, one house is going to be the Senate, and this would be the upper house. For that one, you're going to get equal representation, 2 senators per state. That's kind of what New Jersey wanted, so New Jersey got a little bit of what it wanted. Virginia wanted representation based on population, so they get that in the House. The House of Representatives, the number of representatives is based on your population, and so that's why we do a U.S. Census every 10 years. That and some other reasons, like with where we're going to allocate resources, where we're going to put resources in the country, okay? So now that the legislative branch is settled, now they got to ask themselves about slaves. Do slaves count in this representation? Because remember, Virginia is the major slaveholding state at this time. And so Virginia is definitely trying to have a lot of representatives, because they are going to start yelling out at the convention, let's go ahead and count our slaves into this population. Now, conveniently, they want to count them in the population. They don't want to count them as people, but they don't really understand that yet. They're not there yet. But what you get is a compromise. So the South does get slaves counted in their population. The North is going to get taxation. So you count out 5 slaves. Number 1, 2, and 3 would count for population and for tax purposes. So 1, 2, and 3 will actually give the South more people, or more representatives in the House, but it also makes them pay taxes on it. Slave 4 and 5 are not going to count at all. And so the North goes for this compromise, the South goes for this compromise, so we call it the 3/5 compromise. Another compromise made at the Constitutional Convention is the Electoral College. At the Electoral College, there's a lot of discussion about the president and how the president should be. They go ahead and they agree 4 years for a term. There's some talk about having them appointed for life. Some are like, oh, let's do it every year, but they finally settle on 4. So when the Electoral College comes about, what they decided they're going to do is that you and I will vote in a popular election. So we will do that, and then whoever gets the most from that state, the electors, who are your House and Senator members, will vote for that person in the Electoral College. So instead of North Carolina just doing a popular vote, we do our popular vote, but then we have our 15 Electoral College votes, and those are the votes that go for the president. Today you need 270 electoral votes to win the presidency of the United States. This is meant to ensure that the people's vote actually counts, but it's also meant to make it quick and easy to tell who the president is.